This week is Parshat Lech Lecha, and we learn about Avraham and his journey. And I love this story because there's so much to learn. And Avraham is given to us as the Mefarshim, the commentaries tell us that everything that happened to him, Maseh Avot specifically, is a Siman Labanim, is for us to learn from and how to navigate our lives. And Avram specifically has a lot to teach. And the beginning, I think, is one of the strongest lessons where God tells him, Lech Lecha, to go. And he says to go not just to up and leave, but to leave everything. Me artzecha, mi maladecha, mi beit abicha, so he says to go from your land and your relatives and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And there's a lot of questions just in this pasuk alone. I think that first of all, God is trying to tell him to go from everything, all your experiences that you've had and everything that you know, um, just because of your nurture and what has been ingrained into you until this point, and to part from that and to just go until the land that I will show you. Now, why doesn't God tell him where he's going or how long it's going to take or anything? That's a huge question. But first, I just want to, as sort of an aside, but it's really related, um, to talk about the Lech Lecha, um, about, and a lot of people discuss this, Lech Lecha, that God is saying, go to yourself. He is about to self-actualize. This is the beginning of a journey that is going to bring out everything that Abraham is, every single crucial test. They talk about the 10 tests that Abraham had to go through in order to build his character and pass it on to the later generations. Um, Everything he had to go through was for a purpose to bring something out in his personality, for him to conquer some sort of part of himself and to actualize his potential. And I think it's very important that when he's setting out and is before he's about to do anything, that God doesn't tell him where he's going, how long it's going to take, and all the information. Because, and I think there's a very important lesson, specifically speaks to me. Uh, Lots of people have a fear of the unknown. We don't know what's going to be, and we want to plan out everything. We want to know what's in the future. We want that comfort, but you can never know that. Anything like that you can foresee or plan um, for the future is just your best guess, because there's always something that can be thrown into the mix that you do not know that can change dramatically everything. It can be an outside force or factor, or it can be a choice that you make. And in Abraham's journey, we see things happen that do, I believe, alter the course of events that happened. And I want to talk about specifically situation that is of much debate and cause a lot of emotions in people, and that is um, that when there is first, God tells Abraham to go, and he travels for 3 days, and then God tells him that he promises this land. And I think it's very important to the words he uses. He says, Lizaracha, to your seed, to the future generations. God does not promise Abraham that he is going to live in the land now and that it's his commandment to live in the land now. And I think that's very important. He promises it to the future generations. And that, I think, is important because the next thing right after that we find out is that Abraham has to go down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. And this is the problem, that the discussion. And the Rambam says that it was a wrongdoing on the part of Abraham for leaving Eretz Israel, and he was wrong for um, doing this thing with Sarah that caused her to be taken, and that was all problematic. And I don't really necessarily that doesn't speak to me because and there are other opinions that say no, no. There's a famine. You're supposed to go down. You have to do what you have to do to live and survive and to get food, and that's where the food was. And I think that the famine was by design, and the fact that Abraham had to go to Mitzrayim was also by design. And I think the reason was is that Mitzrayim, as we know, was steeped in immorality, the worst kinds, and Abraham was the other force, the force of good, whereas Isaiah is the force of evil. And Abraham had a potential to influence Paro, because as we see, he understood that Sarah was going to be taken. Perhaps if he navigated that situation differently and spoke up and had a discourse with Paro, perhaps he had the power to change all of Mitzrayim, the face of Mitzrayim. Now, that seems like an overwhelming thing, and you think one person is going to change all of Egypt. It happened. It happened later with Yosef. Yosef was able to change the course of events in Egypt. And I think that perhaps Abraham would have been able to do that too. Now, was it a sin that he didn't? I don't know if it was, I would call it a sin. Who am I to call the greatest, our father of our whole nation, a sinner? But I would like to say that perhaps he had the opportunity to deal with it in a different way. And the way that I see it, and this is again, take it or leave it, or just food for thought, is that he didn't say anything. And when Paro was struck with with a plague, and that he ended up understanding that Sarah was really his wife, and he confronted Abraham and said, "Why did you do this?" Silence. Abraham doesn't say anything. Maybe again, that was the second time, an opportunity for him to say something to Paro, to have a discussion, to bring him closer in an understanding of what are morals and ethics, and how to deal in this world in a proper way. He was an influencer. We know that. He influenced hundreds of people before. And the reason why I'm so convinced of that is because we have a situation where the same thing happens to him again later in Gerar with Avimelech. And I think that we see growth even in Abraham, because when Avimelech says, "Why did you do this? Why did you do this?" Then he finally answers, because they knew there was no God in this place. So he at least starts to speak up. But I think that also perhaps the reason for the Shibud Mitzrayim, the reason for the Jews going down, the reason for Yosef having to influence, and perhaps the 12 tribes having to go down, might have been because God wanted the center of the world at the time. He wanted Egypt to have a recognition of God. What a Kiddush Hashem that would have been if they could have brought the light of God through the center of the universe, and that would have been the effects would resonate out to the whole world. And that was a possibility, and it didn't happen. And once that didn't happen, it had to happen a different way. And again, I don't call this a punishment, but I call this a repercussion of events. And things, once somebody makes a decision, God gives all the generations that are following an opportunity to fix this, but sometimes it's harder. When it's not done right off the bat, things start to change and evolve all over the place, and it's harder to pick up the pieces. And I think that that is why also God doesn't tell us what the plan is and what's exactly going to happen in specifics. And that's why we didn't even hear about Shibud Mitzrayim until way after these things happened, because it was a consequence of events. And it wasn't until later there, way after this whole episode of Mitzrayim with Sarah, that God tells Abraham, because I don't think Abraham was quite understanding, that he should walk before God. And via tamim, which means and to be tamim, whole, perfect. But people say walk with God and be perfect. But I think maybe God is saying walk before God and it will be perfect. Why will it be perfect? If you walk with before God, Avram, trust your instincts. You are always searching for the right thing. You are always trying to do the right thing. And if you go with that instinct of what is right, and you don't not say anything, you do speak up, then good things will happen. And I think God had to be more specific later on to instruct Abraham, don't wait for me. Don't wait for me to tell Abimelech in a dream what he's doing is wrong. You are my messenger. You are my mouthpiece. God doesn't want us to wait for miracles so that people will necessarily learn after the fact because of a horrible plague or something. God wants us to be his messengers. And if we see and know what's right, to speak up and to say that. And if we walk before God to be his messenger, walk before God, meaning let's announce what his purpose is before God has to show up and send the message himself. Let us walk before God. And when we know something's wrong or something's right, and we have the opportunity, we're given an opportunity to speak up, not to fear, even an Abimelech or Paro. We're put in that situation for a reason, like Mordecai told Esther. You're put in this situation for a reason. God put you here for a reason. And we see then she did her job and it worked out to save the whole Jewish nation. And perhaps maybe if Abraham spoke up at that point, it could have saved us from a Sheba Mitzrayim. Perhaps, then there could have been this actualization of God's presence in the world at that point. And every time that we don't speak up when we know something's right or wrong, it gets harder. This has always been my message. So let's go with our good instincts, try and do the right thing as we see it, and hopefully God will bless our efforts and save us from difficulties in the future. And I wish you all a very good Shabbat Shalom.